During this global pandemic and era of social distancing, I've been doing my interviews from home. And this is where I spoke with Steven, who's an expert on organized crime in the Americas.
I think we need to think about them as what they are. They are this, they are a community. We don't like to think of it that way, but in essence, they're a community. And they are built around social bonds. And I think if we are going to combat them, we can't think of them as just a criminal organization, just an organization that is out to commit violent acts. The violence has an end in and of itself, which is to build this cohesion. That's what the violence is about. It's not an end in and of itself. It actually is about creating this group, this strong group cohesion. So we need to think about it more around those ideas of cohesion and create alternative communities from the get-go. The interesting thing about...
I hate to interrupt, but is there an appetite for that? Because, what you're describing makes perfect sense, and yet, I just don't see policymakers going in that direction time and time again.
No, you don't. And the interesting thing is that the entity or organization that really fills that gap is the church. And that is the only escape hatch.
I was going to say, that's their only way out, too, right? It's the church.
That is literally in 99% of the cases, their only escape hatch is through the evangelical church. And that's because it so closely parallels, ironically enough, the gang structure itself. Patriarchal belief in this sort of a higher being, absolute devotion. It monopolizes your time. Especially in the evenings. I mean, every night you have to go to church. Every night you got to hang out with your homeboys. So in so many ways, the communities parallel one another, and there's a respect on the part of the gangs for those who commit themselves to a great extent within these religious communities, and they get respect if they stay committed to those religious communities. If they waver, they can face severe repercussions.
Steven is the co-founder of Inside Crime, a think tank focused on organized crime in the Americas and a senior fellow at American University. He's the author of MS-13, The Making of America's Most Notorious Gang. Steven, I love the title, The Making of America's Most Notorious Gang, which no one can dispute that. And yet reading this, and I felt like I knew a lot about MS-13, like midway through, I was like, I don't really know that much about MS-13. They're kind of an enigma in many respects. You can make them anything you want to, right? I mean, certainly the US president has done that.
Yeah, I think that is the sort of charm or essence of this particular group, is that, they're really a chameleon. I mean, people call them everything from a drug trafficking organization to what I call them, which is they're really a rudimentary social organization. They're almost like a sort of really violent community that coalesces around this idea of violence. But you can take any of their acts, violent acts or criminal acts, and just explode it into whatever you want it to be and whatever you want it to mean, and for whatever political purposes you have around it.
One of the things I thought was really interesting in here, and I'm going to quote it, you point out that 527,000 people were detained by border agents in 2017. Only 228 were believed to be MS-13 members. And yet, if you listen to the US president, you would think 500 out of the 527,000 are these gang members flooding into the United States, that we should live in fear. Were you surprised when you looked at the statistics? I mean, you're a guy who knows these stats. I mean, that kind of jumped out at me.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of things about the gang that we don't know, and certainly size is one of the aspects. There aren't a lot of members of the gang in terms of like, we think of Long Island, and we hear about Long Island a lot, and we have heard about Long Island a lot in the last few years, and you would think it was absolutely overrun with MS-13. But really, when you talk to authorities about it, they'll tell you Oh, well, our estimates are anywhere between 100 and 150 gang members, which is a very different reality when you start to sort of break it down. And, oh, well, what is that? That's, about 10 different subcells, each with about 10 to 15 guys. That's a completely different image than the image that, President Trump would put out when he talks about it, which is that they're occupying entire towns. How are 10 or 15 guys occupying a town? Well, the answer is they're not. That said, they do have an outsized presence. So even though they might be small in number, their acts of violence certainly have an incredible ripple effect, and very often a negative effect, mostly for the Latino communities where they hail from.
Because of the violence in El Salvador, people are fleeing the country for their lives through Mexico to the United States. According to international and U.S. law, a person cannot be returned to a country where they are likely to face torture. But that doesn't always happen.
You have a character who's kind of sprinkled throughout the book, and his name is Norman. If you would, tell us his story, just briefly, and then maybe we can dig a little bit deeper.
Sure. Norman is a person who I originally met while he was in a United States detention center. And he is, at that point, he had been 30 years in the gang. And he was seeking, it wasn't asylum, it's called Convention Against Torture protection in the United States. So the idea is that if he's sent back to El Salvador, there's a greater than 50% chance that he is going to be tortured or killed by the government. So he's presenting this case to the judge at the time and to immigration authorities, right? And his trajectory is very interesting because he kind of encompasses the trajectory of the United States and Salvadoran relations. His family is caught in the middle of this civil war in the 1980s. He grows up amidst that civil war, and by the end of the war, they're exhausted, and they're having to face down all different kinds of difficulties, and they begin to scatter. And they scatter mostly north to the United States. So the family begins to split into pieces. And what's left of the different pieces of the family begin to do different things. On one side of the family, you've got his sister and brother who, begin to make it in the United States, join churches, have that kind of, immigrant experience that perhaps people are familiar with. And on the other side of the family, you've got members of the family joining the gang. So about half the family joins the gang, and about half the family runs, has a sort of what we would consider a kind of normal life. And they're bouncing back and forth between El Salvador and the United States. So his story is happening all within that, and it kind of encompasses this very complex relationship that happens between the United States and El Salvador. He gets very involved over time with the gang, and sort of parallel with that, he has his own family, and eventually he gets jailed for many, many years. He's actually in jail in El Salvador. And it's during this time period that the MS-13 really becomes the MS-13 that we know of in El Salvador. And it's from jail. And he lives this whole experience, and he sees all of this play out and plays a very active role in the construction of the gang from jail. When he gets out of jail, then he's faced with the difficulty of being sort of called back to service, so to say, and he has to show his loyalty to the gang. And in that, he starts to balk. And when he starts to balk, the gang starts to go after him. So when he's out of jail, both the gang and the police start to target him, and then he makes his way to the United States, where I meet him. So it's this, he really kind of encompasses a lot of the trajectory of a typical gang member, of the gang itself, and of this very complex relationship between the United States and El Salvador. So I put him really at the center of the book.
And for good reason, because one of the things that's really interesting is the complexity of this case for the judge, who says the case is haunted. because he's conflicted in a way. He kind of sees this guy as a criminal, and yet Norman makes the case, I go back to El Salvador, I'm dead, which gets into the whole subject matter of how he makes his decision. And yet what I found interesting is the judge rules in his favor, but that, you know, like he's always got to be looking over his shoulder. And that doesn't mean it rules in your favor that, oh, suddenly there's no immigration issues, that you can still be hunted down. I mean, it just seems like he's this tracked, hunted man throughout, right?
You know, so much of what we think about when we think about the gangs are these individuals and these individual acts that they commit to become part of the gang, or once they're in the gang, and they're very often horrific acts. And we judge them. We judge them severely for these acts. But the tension that I wanted to create from the onset of the book was how we judge ourselves as a society. We are constantly marginalizing and putting these people in very bad positions. So that's the tension. And that's the tension that literally he is facing when he faces that judge. And what we are facing as readers. We look at him and we say, do we judge him as an individual? Or do we judge ourselves as a society? Because really that's what the judge has to decide. Is he going to send him back to a failed state, a state that would literally kill him, and a state that has enjoyed United States support for decades? Or do we accept him for what he is, a victimizer, because he was a gang member? You know, so that's the tension. Is it our social guilt or our social responsibility versus his individual responsibility?
Understanding the gang culture in the Americas has been a passion of Steven's that he says was first sparked by his family.
So how do you think your childhood in Chicago helped shape who you are today?
Well, you know, my dad was a Presbyterian pastor, so, you know, he spent a lot of time interacting with the community, creating community, you know, both the church community and the relationship with the community. And that had a big influence on me and how I understand creation of community. And my brothers and sisters, older brothers and sisters, spent a lot of time traveling, in particular to Central America when I was younger. And there was a lot of talk during that time period about the wars that were going on in Central America and United States involvement in those wars and what the role of the United States was. And all of that, you know, kind of coalesced really when I think about this book. You know, the book in a lot of ways is about community and it's about this relationship, this complex relationship that evolves over time between two nations, and kind of unraveling that history and what it births. And sometimes it births great things and sometimes it births really bad things.
Speaking of bad, it's kind of bleak. How do you remain optimistic?
I try and keep, you know, kind of on the positive side of things. Certainly spend more time than not looking for things that work. You know, trying to see, you know, even in these bad situations, you know, what actually has produced good results, and then interacting with these people, you know, and understanding, you know, what their motivations are. I mean, whether or not, you know, kind of getting the background of a gang person or a family of a gang member to understand where they come from, to the police side of things, or law enforcement, or mayors and others. You know, these are the people on the front lines, and telling their stories, I think, services us all. You know, we need to understand how these people are dealing with these real life issues.
MS-13 began on the streets of Los Angeles in the 1980s. It was created by Salvadoran children whose families had fled their country's civil war. It was meant to defend themselves from LA gangs. When large-scale immigrant deportations began, the violence was exported from the U.S. to El Salvador. helping make it one of the world's deadliest countries.
This book, Hollywood Kid, which was written by Oscar Martinez and his brother Juan Jose, the quote is, "I hate, therefore I exist." So talk to me about that, and how does that relate to MS-13?
I highly recommend their book, which is really a deep dive into one single assassin and kind of his life and death in El Salvador. And part of what they do and what I do in my book is to understand what motivates the gang members. We often hear about gangs being, really driven by greed, right? Driven by money, driven by criminal enterprises. They're drug traffickers or they're human traffickers, and they're out for loads of money. They're not. What we've seen over and over and over again is that they have been unable to become a huge drug trafficking organization. In fact, what motivates them is this idea of very often hatred of the other. In this case, it's hatred of the 18th Street gang, their eternal rival. And so that line, "I hate, therefore I exist," is really the core meaning of being part of a gang. It is that only with that rivalry do I have a meaningful relationship with my cohorts. What builds and coalesces around a sort of gang, these small units that are fighting one another, are those violent interactions that they have with these other rivals and amongst themselves. That's what builds cohesion, not making loads of money selling drugs. And that's what we have to understand when we understand about gangs, that this is what binds them. It's these violent interactions, collective violent interactions, that binds them together.
So one of the people you quoted in the book spent 2 decades out there on the front lines, fighting MS-13, and he said, "I always thought the gangs were bad, but the police strategy to fight them had contributed to their rise." So what are the police doing, and are they making mistakes right and left, and what can we learn reading this about their approach?
Yeah, I think that they're of course, like the gangs, we have to give nuance to the police story as well. I mean, there's certainly police that are very thoughtful, very much trying to do the right thing. But I think in general terms, what you have is an overwhelming amount of emphasis on what you would call in El Salvador preventative strategies. They call them preventative strategies, which really means flood the streets. Their thought processes as they go into this is that we're going to arrest our way out of this problem. And that's really as far as it goes. And in the process, they work out many different ways to criminalize activities, whether we're talking about the United States and specifically Los Angeles, which is where a lot of these strategies were born, and they have special units that are some of the first special units that go after gangs, and they become almost a kind of gang in and of themselves. They are stealing paraphernalia. They have their own name. A number of them get embroiled in scandals that are gang-like, robbing banks and killing people and torturing people and theft and resale of drugs and those sorts of things. So you've got that element to it. But the overall policy, which is what gets eventually exported to other countries like El Salvador, is arrest your way out of the problem. And what happens with that is you arrest these guys in massive numbers, whether United States or El Salvador, and they develop a whole nother sort of layer to their organization inside the prison system, because you haven't put the correct attention on what happens inside the prisons. And so they end up controlling the prisons, less so in the United States than in El Salvador, of course, where in the United States they kind of operate under an umbrella organization inside the prisons, but in El Salvador, they become the authority inside the prisons, and their power emanates from their control of the prisons. So not only have you not resolved the problem by arresting these people en masse, but you've added an extra layer to the problem by arresting these people en masse. And unfortunately, the strategy doesn't go much further than that. It sort of rests on this idea of being able to, have a massive presence out in the street and arrest your way out of the problem.
And it's not working.
It's not working.
No.
We're how many years into this? And not only that, again, it's reinforcing and in some ways making the gang and other gangs like them stronger.
Yeah.
I mean, 40 years. I mean, you would think we would try something new, but in fact, they're going the other way. It's increasingly the only strategy left, and the only thing that is one of the few things that is really, really well funded are police and repressive strategies.
Steven, can't thank you enough for sitting out here in the heat and talking about your book. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you for having me.